I'm Stephen Robinson, or the Playtyper guy, as my son calls me. Joining me today is author Alana Best, whose compelling memoir, Around the World in Black and White, details her family's epic year-long trek across the world. And it's not just a travel memoir, though it would be fun and worth your time, even if that. But I think it also um, delves into just what it is to kind of go outside your own sort of comfort zone or outside in the world as a biracial family, as yours is. Thank you for joining me, Alana. And yeah, why don't you just tell us about, well, one, your trip itself, and then what inspired you to write this book?
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be on your wonderful podcast. In 2018, just before the pandemic hit, we decided to take our kids. One was 5 weeks old at the time of departure, and the other one was 10 years old, and travel around the world and take good advantage of our wonderful parental leave up here in Canada, as well as some savings. And we started off in Asia, basically traveled around there for a month and a half, 2 months. And then we came back, took the 10-year-old down to California, Disneyland, all that. Then we went to Egypt, did a huge chunk of time around Europe, and then we finished off in South Africa.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's quite ambitious, especially with, had you ever, you and your husband prior to having kids, had you gone on many trips before or of this length and breadth?
Not like this. No, definitely not. This was the first, and thought it was going to be this, just this dream come true to be able to take your children, be able to travel around the world. And for a lot of it, it was. But we just thought, what a wonderful gift to give ourselves as a family to spend this bonding time together with our kids. And be able to, just see the world and experience it like through your kids' eyes. Anybody who's a parent knows seeing the world, like even your own backyard, is incredible. So to be able to travel with them and see it through their eyes, it's a real gift.
And obviously, as you the detail in the book, you encountered some, I would say, challenges or things you might not have expected. Can you sort of walk us through some of that and when you started noticing um, perhaps how you were being perceived or as a
Yeah.
family?
Definitely. So some of the challenges began quite early, and to your previous question of why I decided to write this book, like I had no intentions of writing a book. I had intentions of traveling around the world with my family for a year and experiencing all the wonderful and sometimes challenging and hard things about travel. But it became really apparent very quickly that that this was going to be much more than that. So when we went to Asia, I would say within the first couple of weeks, there were people wanting, like, we're attracting a lot of attention. So people wanting to take pictures of mostly my partner and our child together, Kimani, who was 5 weeks old. And sometimes it seemed to me like, oh, they just are maybe really interested, or they haven't seen Black people, or they haven't seen interracial couples before. And he was like, no, I'm feeling some negative vibes from this. And I was a bit dismissive of it. And then it got to the point where people were just like blatantly pointing and laughing at him. And I was like, what's going on? It totally burst my bubble. I couldn't dismiss it anymore as being anything different than, extremely racist. And it made us have conversations that we weren't having before this about the ways in which he is treated, invited, welcomed in this world, and how I walk through this world, which are drastically different. And then through an exposure of traveling with a Black man for an entire year, I could see in all of the micro and macro ways that we're treated very differently in spaces all over the world.
Hmm. Um, and your husband or partner who's Black is Canadian as well, like you're both so. And you'd met in Canada. And what was your experience just in Canada? I think you're in Victoria, if I understand correctly.
Yes, I'm in Victoria, British Columbia, so just north of Seattle. And we've lived kind of a bit all over the place in Canada, but this is where we've settled. And he was born in Canada. His parents were born in Barbados. There's always so some of the things that have happened in Canada are pretty, I would say, micro, and or we just didn't talk about it. So, for example, like there was an incident where somebody had made a racial slur to him, but it was clear he had some addiction problems, he had some mental health problems. So I kind of dismissed it. And then there was other incidences where we talked about later, where he's like, oh yeah, if I go into Home Depot to go get some stuff for the house and I bring a tape measure in, I make sure that when I walk into the store, I'm clearly showing it in my hand. Mm-hmm. Whereas I would just put it in my purse, take it out and put it back without thinking about it. He's like, no, you never give people a reason to think that maybe you've taken it or that it wasn't yours to begin with. But we never talked about those things. And I didn't notice that's what he was doing. So it's not that it doesn't exist in Canada. We certainly have things to work on in Canada. There certainly are incidences, but we just hadn't really talked about it. And I didn't understand that we were walking in this world in such different ways.
Absolutely. And part of the travel and something that you go on the book is sort of going through security, how that is somewhat different. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we took 56 plane rides throughout this year and in 26 different countries. And I can say without a shadow of a doubt, we are racially profiled. And to the point where it's predictable patterns. So I knew that I could start to test out what's going on. I was like, oh, do we get always pulled over for sort of an extra layer of security because he's the one going first? So then I would try and go first and then just say, oh, we're all together. And then they would kind of let us all go through. And then I was like, well, I wonder if it'd make a difference if he had the kid with him. And it's like, nope, if he's got the kid, he still gets it all. I'm like, oh, I wonder if it would make a difference if he's got all the baggage and the kid. So it makes it look like we're all together. Nope, he always gets pulled over. And so we got to the point where I had to sort of be careful about what was going on because we'd miss flights in between. And the one time that he traveled without me, he was going from Greece to Ireland to go visit his sister. And I was staying in Greece with a kid and my sister was visiting. He was detained for a long period of time, questioned by multiple officers. At least when I was there, that hadn't happened. But the one time he flew by himself, he was detained and almost missed his flight. The only reason he got his flight was because it had been pushed back and delayed. So that also really opened my eyes, because I think when you travel once in a while with somebody and something happens, you can dismiss it. You can say, oh, well, maybe this isn't that frequent, or maybe your senses are a bit off with it. And then once you see it frequently and exposed to it to that point, you can't deny it. It's just, that's the way it is. And it's a sad sort of reality that I had learned sort of along the way.
And, I grew up in the American South, and I know, I think the experience perhaps might, if I might ask, could be a little bit different. I suppose if your experience growing up, perhaps prior to meeting your husband, because you talked about not dismissing him, but dismissing some of the situations. Perhaps is it a case of where you just weren't exposed to so much overt racism, so perhaps wasn't thinking it was such an issue on a macro and even micro level, compared to, say, someone if you'd grown up in a very racist small town in a rural Alabama or something, you might have been more aware it was going to happen once you married a Black man or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think I have been asked that question, how were you not aware? And I think it's partially you know that racism exists in the world. You're not living under a rock, but you think what I was exposed to, a big part of it was, oh, that happens more in other geographical locations. For example, there's a stereotypical Southern United States, or that it happened more overtly in different time periods, and the stuff that you see in the news is an anomaly, not a reality of every day, all the time, everywhere you are. And so, and I didn't see it, or we didn't talk about it in the same way that we did when we were on this trip. So I think it was a combination of those things. And when I spoke to, part of the reason why I wrote this book is when I spoke to a lot of white people, like white friends, white family members, about our experiences, they were also shocked. And like, okay, so it's not just me that's shocked. So there's this divide of understanding of the amount of racism that exists, I think, in the world, and what people are walking through and going through. I think people of color think that everybody knows and is aware that it is happening on a more regular basis. And I think there are a lot of white people that are walking around thinking that it's not as bad as it is.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's certainly my experience. I know friends of mine who are white, who I grew up with in the South, are kind of like, oh yeah, I had a racist uncle, or I knew race. Like, I get that there's racism is bad and we should do something about it. And when I moved to, even when I moved to New York, because New York, the racial tension was almost some ways even more overt. I was there in the mid 90s, but like when I moved to the Northwest, it was a lot of what you described of like, this is all something that is either happened a long time ago or happens only in the South, to the point where I had a friend who um, was in a biracial family as well, and her children had never been to the American South, but had been to, like, say, Sweden. And I was sort of like, well, they should see New Orleans. There's a lot to see in the South, culturally, that would be of relevance to them. And but I think that experience is interesting, and I think it's sort of, in good faith, like if you're not around racist people, you perhaps are not imagining that it's occurring. Um, and also, not to psychoanalyze you, it must be difficult to see that while having small children, because no parent wants to think like, okay, I thought this was set, like the next generation is going to be post-racial utopia, and not, I don't want my children to have to live through this. So what can you speak to on that aspect of it?
Yeah, there was a definite awakening to an understanding of the reality that my kids are going to be treated a certain way, viewed a certain way, walk through this world a certain way because of the color of their skin and nothing else. And if I didn't stop the like white privilege of naivety and try to better understand that and what they're going to go through, how was I going to be able to prepare them for this world? And that is our number one job, is to help them be the best people they can in this world, to help prepare them for independence, to help them be in this world. So to me, it was up to me to like shatter my previous non-understanding of what was going on and make a real effort to better be able to understand what they are going to go through, so that I can help them and I can prepare them and I can be a better mom and a better global citizen.
And going back to your trip, so you had described experience in Asia. Could you describe some other perhaps experience you might have had in other parts of the country that we might have seen, or was it similar or just consistent to that, or was there a difference?
Yeah, there were many incidents. I would say there were incidences all over the place. So, different place in Asia and in Africa, even there are many places people are very, they want to know what's behind our relationship. So there's this view of like, oh, do you only date Black men? Is there like some sort of fetish thing? Or did you marry a Black man knowing he was Black? Is there a power dynamic there? Is there a money dynamic there? Why would you guys be together? So I think there's this wanting to understand why you're together, and it can't be for the simplicity of love. There has to be some other underlying thing of why you would be together. So that comes up very often in multiple different cultures, trying to understand the dynamics of our relationship. And I think there was a lot of things that I learned, not just about, racism. Lots of people wanting to touch Kimani's hair, obviously, wanting to touch his skin, making a lot of comments of like he was like lighter skinned at the beginning. He's a little bit darker now, but like they would say like face like dada, skin like mom. always commenting about how they look like the dad. I learned a lot of white privilege things. So I'll give you just one other storytelling. I was in France, and we were just at a grocery store picking up things. We're traveling for the years, so getting, diapers and like a few basics for the house. And I don't have a car, so I'm carrying a very large bag purse thing, putting items inside of that bag so that I know when it's full that I don't overdo it, then can't walk home.
Mhm.
And so I'm doing this, and Roland is going around with the cart, and he comes around, and I'm like trying to check a label on something, ask him to hold the bag for me. And he like jumps back half a foot and is like, I am not touching that bag. And Roland would always hold the bag for me. He's the most kind, like wonderful human. And so I was really shocked. And I was like, I just need to check this label. Can you please? And he's like, Alana, there's been a security guard trailing me this entire time. Haven't you noticed? And I was like, what? And I noticed that. I was like, oh, okay, there is somebody watching him. And I said, okay. And he's like, what are you doing? I was like, I just want to make sure that I've got enough space, try to explain the story. And then he looks at my daughter, Josephine, who's 10 years old. And she's like drinking this drink because she was thirsty and it's not paid for yet. And I'm like, I'm just used to doing that. Like you just, you can eat something or drink something and then we just pay for it at the end and it's not a big deal. And he was just like, check your white privilege right now. I'll live in a very nice way. And I was like, and then he's like, I just gotta go. I'm gonna go find these items. So he left, and the security guard continued to trail him, even though we're consuming items that we haven't paid for, and I'm throwing stuff into my purse that haven't been paid for. And I remember being like, it's fine. It doesn't matter. Even if the security guard gave me trouble, like I would sort it out with the manager, and I'd ask for an apology and everything would be okay. And he was like, but if I did that, that might not be the result. It might escalate, and then I might be viewed as aggressive, and then police might come. And then he's like, I know from experience what the likely outcome is for me, and his likely outcome might be a very different thing. And so we act very differently in sort of all situations. So that was another.
Yeah, it's sort of a very culturally different experience. And when you talked about traveling together and the folks with the reaction, it does seem you're right. It's sort of, instead of it just being treated as a couple who had met and fallen in love or whatever, it's seen as a political or cultural statement. So people were asking these questions that perhaps you would not get if you were of the same race, which is, and you've talked about some of these misconceptions. I'd like to go through with you. So the idea that white women who date black men have a thing for black men, or a fetish, like they're sort of very sexually charged, or some weird arguments surrounding that. And, I presume you'd encounter that even in Canada, because that's unfortunately a pretty wide ranging kind of issue. But how do you usually respond to that? Or what's your thought?
Yeah, it's a really interesting, because my daughter, who was 10, who came with me, was from my first marriage, and she's white.
Mhm.
So my previous husband was white. So it's like, it also added to the dynamic of our situation traveling, is that, you had, a black husband, a white wife, but then there's this white daughter, and then there's this mixed child. It's like a very modern family situation, traveling the world. But, generally I try to hide my shock and be calm and provide a non-judgmental space to have the conversation. Because to me, I feel if people tend to ask me questions they wouldn't ask of my partner. I think people are worried about offending him, and they're like less worried about offending me with some of their questions. And so to me, it's an opportunity to try and have that chat. Like, oh, like, no, I've dated a lot of white men. My ex-husband was white. Like, I'll answer the question then, but then I will kind of go back and say, why do you feel that way? Why would you ask that question? Would you ask that question if, to try and, try to kind of get to the root and sort of steer them towards, there's a reason why you're asking that question, and it's based in some biases and some of what like the world has educated and taught us to stereotype in. So let's like re-educate ourselves on those and those initial instincts and those initial conversations and thoughts, and reorient ourselves into why we're actually asking that and what's the root of that, and to rethink that.
Yeah, and then obviously the converse is that black men pursue white women for sort of charged kind of status symbol aspects and sort of things that, and almost a rejection of black women, and of course, obviously, in most cases, the black man's own mother, which is very obviously offensive. Um, and I'm sure he's experienced that from either side of like making those kind of sort of assumptions, or that white women are easier than black women, which is, I know, a has been a source of, I would say, dubious humor in stand-up comics for generations now. But it's fascinating how that's sort of still kind of perceive, like people, it's not just a joke, like people sort of absorb that and then believe it's something that is actually true and reflective of what was motivating how you two got along or got together.
Yeah, definitely. And we've had moments where, we've been in the Caribbean and on some buses where I can feel the tension of like people feeling like you have taken, you've taken this black man, basically. And yeah, it's really, it's tough, right? Because at the onset, I'm like, I've just met this, this wonderful human being, and you don't really realize what you're saddling yourself, your kids to, your relationship to, by by doing this, by being in an interracial couple. And it's very interesting, all of you know the concepts people have in their heads, and what you have to kind of get back to the basics, like, no, it's just love. No, it's just love. That's it.
Oh yeah, and certainly the the silliness that people have to confront the fact that your children are siblings, and people either not believing that or being creepy about it in certain situations. Just one of those unfortunate things that you'll have to sort of contend with. But they're
Oh
siblings, so
yeah,
yeah,
lots of things, right? Like, oh, where did you adopt your kids? Like, I
yeah.
had, lots of questions about that. Or my daughter, who met my partner Roland when she was 5 years old, and Roland would go and pick her up from school, do other things, like, she's just been a part of her life forever. She used to just say, "Oh, my dad's coming," but then she quickly realized that everybody wouldn't accept that
Hmm.
because he was black and she clearly wasn't. And so she felt the need to like make everybody else comfortable and explain things to everybody all the time. So we would, even when we were traveling, we would show up at a tour, and she would automatically, before they could ask, start explaining our family dynamic to them. And I was like, it's just another layer, really, of people needing to fit things into boxes. And instead of just being able to accept that families and couples come in many different facets, and that it's not just one way.
Yeah, or being different, especially for children. My son is 9, and he uses mobility aids, cerebral palsy, and he he's got to the point where he doesn't enjoy having to sort of tell an origin story to people of like, especially when it's often directly sort of framed as what's wrong with you, which he does not believe anything is wrong with him. So I think that's, if I could make that connection, I think it does seem as if your daughter sort of like having to proactively explain her family because to people who are going to assume something's wrong with the family, or it's being sort of a kind of constant othering, which is very a sort of a crappy thing to project upon anyone, to sort of take everyone at who they are and not make people have to. explain themselves, I would suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel you. My so Kimani, the one that's 5 weeks old during the trip, has autism. And so it's so similar, like, because he's got some speech delays. And so it's like automatically the like trying to, and I think what's so interesting about it is like, it's always to make other people feel comfortable. And instead of them just being comfortable with that, there's, there's a wide range
Yeah,
of
it
diversity.
doesn't change how we connect or whatever. It's not, and even if you're coming from a safety perspective of wanting to make sure someone is the guardian, their race is not going to be conclusive of that. There's just as much chance. So I think what happens is a lot of folks tend to want to have everything sort of what is different needs to be not just explained, but in a way justified. And I think that is sort of what is challenging. Um, uh, but and is your partner's family in the Canadian area as well? Is that do you have that kind of larger family dynamic where you
Yeah,
are?
my unfortunately his parents have now passed, and but his sister is here, and we got some cousins, and then my brother is here as well, and some cousins. So it's good. We do have a bit of a family dynamic, and we are actively trying to be better at finding community of interracial couples. And in the Black community within Victoria, it's a bit smaller than some of the many of the places that in the United States. But we do think it's really important for for our kids and for us as couples and for us as a family to have that community with us.
I love Victoria. My wife and I have been there a few times, and it's actually the first when my son got his passport. It's the first place we went to. I think he was barely a year old, and my father, his grandfather, was seeing us for Christmas, and he came out at the same time, and it was his first time with a passport as well. He had never left the country, so there's a photo of the two of them, their first times outside of America. Um, in Victoria. We love it. It's a wonderful spot. But we haven't actually ventured much out of the downtown areas and so forth. But I imagine it's not all that sort of quaint British aspect. It's sort of also like, I want to say normal, but like places where you would just raise a family and do your own thing, I suppose.
Yeah, like it is a beautiful town. It's a beautiful space to be. It's very non-Canadian cold, which we love.
Yes,
There's
that is
palm
great.
trees. Yeah. So please holler the next time you come
No,
down. We'd
thank
love
you.
to, grab a drink or coffee. And yeah, but it is like, but it's also sort of what we consider the progressive, we have a very liberal, like politically views are quite liberal. And I think that was maybe part of the naivety, going into this. And I do state like an incident that happened in Victoria in the book where, we were coming home from Easter dinner and somebody had over the night written the N word across the windshield of his car, and he found it the next morning when he went with his son Kimani with our son, and he went outside to go get something from the car and saw it written on the car. And I say that because sometimes there's also this misconception that like Canada's this utopian perfect place. And it's like, I think we've got a lot of things right, and we're doing a lot of good things, and we're trying really hard and continuing to make progress. But this book is not about pointing fingers at everybody else and saying that other cultures aren't as progressive, aren't there. Like, we have our own work to do too. And I think
Mhm.
that's important to state and to remember that this is about all of us collectively.
Oh,
Leveling up.
absolutely. I think especially because, again, Victoria is this wonderful city. My wife and I were in New York. A lot of folks, especially if you are in cities, and I've written for One Cat about this, of how um, in certain ways, whenever I've traveled, it's like there's no sort of borders. It's more of kind of sometimes different sort of cultural extremes, sometimes rural or urban. Even that's too reductive. But I think you can get in the sense of where you are within a sort of cultural sphere, perhaps in a city that seems like, okay, everything's kind of cool, or I know what the situation is, and you leave that sphere, it can be confrontational, and that can be a challenge because part of why you travel and why, when you went on this, was to get outside that your backyard, your comfort zone. So,
Mhm.
we've joked, my wife and I have joked about that. The folks who, especially if you have the means to do it, certainly they go from, sort of like in Star Trek, you beam down into the place and there's a domed city. So you go from one, well-off city to another well-off city someplace. Everyone speaks English there. And you're very much not necessarily seeing all of the world of differences and so forth. And it's kind of, as a big fan of Anthony Bourdain, and I've kind of always been like, no, I want to go out and really see everywhere, like, not just the major city of this country, but someplace off the beaten path. And there is privilege. 'Cause frankly, everyone has privileges in their own way. So would you say there? You talked about your white privilege. There's for me, there's a male privilege of where certain places I can go, that I think of, oh, this is the real deal, and this is off the beaten path. But for my wife, would be like not particularly kind of safe. I don't know if you had experienced some of that, especially. I'm not going to try to stereotype where that might have occurred, but just had you experienced any parts of the country where sort of your husband, as a man, was given a bit of more latitude in ways that you weren't, especially as a modern woman in a world of perhaps not being surprised by that degree of reception or
Yeah, we when we were in Egypt, I think is the place where we had experienced it the most. And it's eh, yeah, I think you're 100% bang on, right? Like you go to get out of your comfort zone, and with that, you're going to be challenged. And in some ways, it's a reminder that we have, like, globally some more work to do. It's sometimes also a reminder of the work that we need to do internally and the work that we need to do back home. So I think all those things are important. It was very hard in Egypt. We were there for over a month, and often people wouldn't even talk directly to me. I would ask a question and they would respond to my husband to speak to me, or they would just disregard what I said. Um, and I couldn't just walk to the ATM by myself. I had to be escorted. And so I felt like my own free will was not
oh yeah.
happening. But then it was also, like there were moments where it was about me and I was just like, man, I miss my basic freedoms. Um, then I was also speaking with some of the locals. So we had this tour guide who was a woman, which is not very common. And I had the most enlightening conversations with her about, like just talking to her about divorce and the ability to leave a relationship or a bad relationship, your ability to marry again, your ability to get an education, your ability to maintain employment even after you have children. And she was talking about how things were changing in Egypt, and some of her friends and the choices that they were making were significantly different from the previous generation. So it was really interesting just speaking to her and figuring out kind of where they were at and where she was at on her own, like, sort of feminist journey. And it gave me a lot of hope, even though there were moments that I was like, man. But you speak to someone, you're like, okay, there is change. There's this sort of underbelly movement that is happening. They are seeing, and it was quite interesting.
And so what kind of was the moment of like, I have a story here that I would like to tell? Sort of, was there a specific moment that sort of tripped you into that, of thinking, I'm going to start taking notes, or I'm going to like, I need to
I was
distill all this?
I did have a moment where I was speaking with my brother and his wife, and I was telling all these stories about what was going on and sort of my awareness of white privilege. And like, this is like, this is pre George Floyd. This is pre the like last Black Lives Matter movement. And I think I really felt the impacts of what I was being exposed to. And so I think were my friends and family as I was telling the stories. And she was the one that said, you should write a book. And I thought about it, but she really planted the seed. And I think I kept thinking, I was about 2/3 of the way through the journey. And I think I kept thinking about it, thinking like, who am I to write a book? Who wants to hear about our family travel story? And then I was like, it's not about me. It's about your story, and about that many white people aren't exposed to this the way you are. And this might, if you're vulnerable and you say what you really thought during these moments and how your thoughts change, and the growth that you went through, maybe they'll see themselves in that and be able to, relate to that growth and relate to that change, and you'll affect some change in your own way. So, writing a book, I had no idea how much work and effort is, like 4.5 years. And it's a privilege too. It's a lot of money to like put into editing. You very rarely make your money back. It's not about that. To me, it's about the story. It's about what was in there and how can you impact and how can you change people. Like, why else are we on this earth if if you can't, make some movement forward? And I remember the real linchpin being when I was in South Africa. We went to Soweto, which is like where Mandela grew up. And they had the only sort of professionally Black run tattoo parlor there. So we went to go get some tattoos. The tattoos were taking a really long time. And I took my daughter out, and we had to kind of leave the store, go around the corner to use a washroom that is a kind of bit of a public washroom. And everybody was staring at me, and we were the only white people in a very Black environment. We were there until kind of late at night. By the time the artists had finished, we were walking out. There were all of these people sort of staring at me, like my white skin was glowing like a freaking beacon. And I was nervous and scared. And then I got into the car, and I'm like looking back at my kids, and I kind of broke down and was like, why was I scared? There was nothing really to be scared about other than my uncomfortableness of being a minority in a space, and that I've got these preconceptions of like Black people. And I felt like, what's going to be really horrible is one day my son is going to be old enough that he's going to instill some sort of fear in somebody else for no reason. And that's what I'm doing. And I was like, this needs to change. This needs to stop. And we need to have better conversations as white people about this.
I remember having that thought as well about my own son. And I remember this one lady, white woman, very helpfully suggesting, it was just like, just let him know that there will be a point where he's not cute anymore. Like, as if that's a good thing. Like that the loss of innocence is something that you should just tell a child. And it's not something the world should actually fix. That he is the fact that, well, he's not going to become a werewolf, and you shouldn't be legitimately scared of werewolves. Like, but he is like a human being, and maybe if we see everyone as the child they once were, regardless of race, that will change perhaps how we perceive adults, instead of just thinking, okay, well, now you're at the age of where I can be afraid of you and clutch my purse and do all of that and cross the street to get away from you and all the sort of stuff that I just sort of assume as part of life for myself. I know of your experience, I don't judge that, because you don't have decades of that sort of experience of, like, if you go in spaces, I grew up in spaces, I was often the only Black person there. And obviously I live in Portland now, so that's very common. And it's not something you think about after a while. You understand that. And I think you either get used to it or you process it differently. And if you don't have it, it's almost sort of like not having sort of the antibodies to fight off something. Like, you don't have the antibodies to fight off that feeling of being different, or people looking at you and noting that you're different. And it's not a crime to have never experienced that. So
but I hope more white people do. I think it is so crucial to be put into places where that uncomfortableness is happening, and think about all of the people that they interact with every day, and in the boardroom at the coffee shop or whatever, that because it's very rare that they do experience being the minority.
I had mentioned that to a friend who had studied, I think, in Japan for a while, and was very much because she was the tallest person and the whitest person, and having that feeling of being. And then she left, and as I said, yes, and then it ended. You left and came back to a place where you, and what you described is essentially feeling like you're back home. And
Yeah.
so there is that weird sense of, as a minority, where is home? Because you're home, there is no place of where you are the default. And I think that's just a matter of, it's not about guilting people, it's more about sort of understanding what it's like for people who live where
Yeah,
they're constantly
absolutely.
not the
It's
default.
growing empathy, growing understanding, I think is important.
So I think that experience you had, I think, is something. It is good to do. It is good to travel. That's something I really liked about your book, and I hope that people will take that from it. Of like, still do the journey, do the travel. You're going to have some experiences where that are perhaps confrontational or shocking, but it's important. It's for the growth. Um, any other trips that you are thinking about doing or would do, or are you
We
still in
just
the travel
came back
game?
from Monaco and the French Riviera last week. So
Very good.
I know it's a tough life. But now I think we're on lockdown for a little bit. We need to replenish the bank accounts.
No,
But
yeah,
it was great. It's beautiful there and a wonderful escape. And yeah,
yeah. We, my wife and I spent a week in Nice,
all nice.
and it was this beautiful area. There was an all-you-can-eat mussels and fries place that I think we put out of business, but we was the wonderful, just beautiful. I always recommend that part of France because it's sort of often when, especially for people who live in big cities, they what they think of as being Paris, especially having watched sort of American in Paris, is really found in those smaller. Like they want really more of the cobblestones and more of the kind of small streets and whatever. But Paris is also an astonishingly beautiful city. So there is so much to see. I mean, that is kind of the we love traveling, and we love going to different places and everything. I mean, my sense that people tend to be pretty good. I think you just but there will be experiences. Perhaps this comes from my being someplace where people can be growing up in the American South. I'm used to sometimes people being crappy anyway. So
Yeah,
outside, I
I
think
think
there's
that's
you
it.
encounter a lot of. But yes, I found that people can be generous in their homes to outsiders, which is nice, and you sort of get what you put out there. But at the same time, it is important, as you explained, that like your we sometimes think that places are better necessarily than our own. I think it's definitely, if you're in America, if you'd been in America, especially during, frankly, the Trump years, you sort of think anywhere's better than this and so forth. And that's, not always the case. I think you find some places where every place has some work to do on being better to everyone else. Um, so, where can people find both you and your book?
So again, my name's Alana Best, and my handles are at Alana Best Author. If you want to find me on social media, on Instagram, Facebook, and then you can purchase the book anywhere you buy your online books. It's on Amazon, Indigo, so all of those places, and you can check also your local bookstore and library. It's in some of those as well.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Alana. This was such a great conversation, an important one, and I really appreciate your book. I recommend that people check it out. It's, you know, um, you are a very typical family. Well, sometimes people might think otherwise, but you're, as the line from, as the Tom Hanks said, and You Got Mail, an American family, or not American, but Canadian family. Normal, his saying that in the sense of you're a perfectly normal family. So thank you for sharing your family story with us. And thanks, everyone. Please like, share, subscribe, and we will be with you next time. Take care.